March 9, 1945. The Pacific night swallowed the runways of Guam, Tinian, and Saipan as one B-29 superfortress after another rolled forward and lifted into the sky. The engines roared, the aircraft climbed, and something felt wrong. The bombers were lighter than they had ever been on a combat mission. Crews felt it immediately in the controls, in the way the aircraft responded as it pulled free of the earth, not because they carried less fuel, not because the mission had been made safer, but because their guns were gone. On the tarmacs below, thousands of pounds of steel lay abandoned, turrets, ammunition boxes, fire control systems, 50 caliber machine guns that had once been the only reassurance standing between a young airman and a fighter attack. Maintenance crews had ripped them out under cover of darkness, sealing the empty gun positions with metal plates. Each B-29 had been stripped of more than 6,000 pounds of defensive firepower. The crews knew exactly what that meant. They were being sent straight into the heart of the Japanese capital with almost no ability to fight back. They would not fly at 30,000 feet, where doctrine said bombers were safest. They would fly at 5,000, low enough to see rooftops, low enough to be hit by small arms fire. Slow, heavy with bombs, and exposed, rumors spread as the aircraft taxied. Some called it madness. Others called it a death sentence. For many, it felt like something worse, a calculated gamble made by men far above them, using their lives as stakes. This wasn't a navigational error. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't desperation. It was a deliberate choice. Somewhere, that decision had been made and locked in, despite every rule written in the manuals and every instinct drilled into the crews. And now the bombers were committed, disappearing one by one into the darkness, forming a long, invisible stream across the Pacific. Ahead lay Tokyo, the largest city on Earth, sprawling, wooden, and dry. Behind them lay the last chance to turn back. By morning, the world would wake to the aftermath of that decision. And history would record what happens when doctrine is abandoned, morality is tested, and war is reduced to a single brutal question: how far are you willing to go to make it end? By early 1945, the American air war against Japan had reached an uncomfortable standstill. On paper, the strategy was sound. B-29 superfortresses flew at altitudes above 30,000 feet, safely beyond the effective reach of most Japanese anti-aircraft guns. Crews attacked in daylight, using precision bombing techniques refined over Europe. It was modern, scientific warfare, measured, controlled, and confident in its logic. In theory, this kind of bombing would dismantle Japan's industrial base piece by piece, making a ground invasion unnecessary. In reality, it was failing. For months, B-29s had crossed the Pacific and released their bomb loads from extreme altitude. But Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, and dozens of other industrial centers refused to break. Reconnaissance photos told a frustrating story: craters neatly punched into factory roofs, scorch marks on concrete, shattered windows, and then, weeks later, signs of repair. Machinery was moved. Production resumed. Smoke cleared, and the war machine kept turning. Japan's geography and weather worked against the Americans. At 30,000 feet, crews battled fierce jet stream winds that no one had fully understood before the campaign began. Bombs released precisely according to calculations were pushed miles off target before reaching the ground. Entire industrial districts simply vanished beneath clouds, leaving bombardiers guessing at shapes they could barely see. The numbers were damning after more than 1,600 sorties. After 3,600 tons of high explosives, the reduction in Japanese war production was estimated at less than 2%. Aircraft engines were still being built. Ammunition still rolled off assembly lines. Replacement parts still reached the front. The bombing campaign that was supposed to shorten the war was barely slowing it. Inside briefing rooms and headquarters across the Pacific, the implications were impossible to ignore. The B-29 program had cost billions of dollars. It represented the most advanced bomber ever built and the core of America's strategy for defeating Japan without a bloody invasion. And yet, month after month, the results fell far short of expectations, while bombers struggled overhead. Planners on the ground moved forward with something far worse: the invasion, first came Okinawa, a stepping stone toward the Japanese home islands. Intelligence officers studied terrain maps and casualty projections with growing dread. Okinawa alone would cost tens of thousands of lives, and it was only the beginning. Next was Kyushu, the southern island of Japan. Then Honshu, the heart of the empire. Operation Downfall, the full invasion plan, assumed fanatical resistance. Intelligence reports described civilians being trained with bamboo spears. Children taught to resist American soldiers, entire populations mobilized for last-ditch defense. Japanese forces had shown repeatedly that surrender was not an option they embraced. Casualty estimates varied, but none were reassuring. Some projections predicted hundreds of thousands of American dead. Others ran higher, 500,000, even 1,000,000 casualties once wounded and missing were included. And those were only American losses. Japanese civilian casualties were expected to be catastrophic. Every mile closer to Japan brought the same conclusion: the war was far from over, and ending it would come at an unimaginable cost. Yet the bombing doctrine remained unchanged at high altitude, daylight, precision. It was clean, it was defensible, and it was not working. Inside the air forces, few were willing to say it out loud. Doctrine was more than a strategy, it was an article of faith. To abandon it was to admit that years of planning, training, and sacrifice had been built on assumptions that no longer applied, but facts were stubborn things. Japan was not Germany. Its industry was not centralized into massive factories that could be neatly targeted and destroyed. By 1945, much of Japanese war production had been dispersed, broken into thousands of small workshops, many of them inside homes and residential neighborhoods. Aircraft parts, ammunition components, and mechanical assemblies were being produced in backrooms, sheds, and converted living spaces. You could not precision bomb a workshop hidden inside a wooden house, and the longer the doctrine remained unchanged, the clearer the consequences became. Bombing from high altitude preserved American bombers, but it preserved Japanese production too. Every month the war continued meant more young Americans drafted, trained, and shipped across the Pacific for an invasion that grew deadlier by the day. Somewhere, someone had to confront the truth that no one wanted to face. The strategy that felt morally comfortable was strategically ineffective. The strategy that followed the rulebook was extending the war, and the cost of maintaining that illusion would be paid in blood. By early 1945. The question was no longer whether doctrine was failing. It was whether anyone had the will to admit it, and the courage to replace it with something that might actually end the war. Major General Curtis LeMay was not a man driven by theory, tradition, or comfort. He had spent his career watching neat ideas collide with violent reality, and he had learned a hard lesson early: doctrine did not win wars, results did. For LeMay, success was measured in one currency only, and it was not territory or tonnage. It was lives. Every decision he made was filtered through a single question: how many Americans would die if this failed? In early 1945, LeMay stood over reconnaissance photographs of Tokyo, studying them not as a city, but as a system. What he saw confirmed what months of frustration had already suggested. Japan's war economy did not resemble Germany's vast industrial complexes or easily identifiable factories. It was fragmented, improvised, and deeply embedded within civilian life. Workshops were scattered across neighborhoods. Machine tools sat inside wooden homes. Families worked long hours producing parts for aircraft engines, weapons, and ammunition. Intelligence estimates showed that nearly 40% of Japan's war production was being carried out inside residential areas. There was no factory roof to target, no smokestack to mark. You could not precision bomb a workshop hidden inside someone's living room from 30,000 feet. The doctrine demanded accuracy. But accuracy against what? A city built of wood and paper, hiding its war machine in plain sight? High-altitude bombing preserved American bombers, but it also preserved the very system they were supposed to destroy. LeMay understood that continuing along the same path would not shorten the war. It would only delay the inevitable invasion and multiply the casualties on both sides. So, he began calculating, not emotionally, Not impulsively. Coldly, he studied Japanese air defenses and found another uncomfortable truth. Japan's fighter force had been gutted. Fuel shortages grounded many aircraft. Pilot training programs had collapsed. Heavy anti-aircraft guns were designed to engage bombers, flying high in predictable paths, not aircraft slipping through the darkness at low altitude. Night fighting capability was limited. Radar coverage was inconsistent. Searchlights relied on visibility that darkness could deny. The enemy, like American doctrine, was prepared to fight the last war, not the next one. That realization led LeMay to a conclusion so radical it bordered on heresy. If altitude was the problem, go low. If daylight made bombers predictable, fly at night. If defensive guns reduced payload and invited formation flying, remove them. If high explosives failed to cripple production, use fire. The decision he formulated would redefine air warfare. No daylight. No high altitude. No heavy defensive guns, instead night bombing. Low altitude, incendiaries, maximum payload. Each element violated the principles taught to bomber crews since the beginning of the war. Each carried its own risks. Together, they represented a complete rejection of the manual. When LeMay presented the plan to his senior staff, the reaction was immediate and hostile. Strip the guns, they said, and the bombers will be helpless against fighters. Those turrets were the crew's only protection, their last line of defense. Removing them felt like sending young men into combat naked. Fly low, they argued, and anti-aircraft fire will tear the formations apart. Every rifle, every machine gun, every light flak battery in Tokyo would have a clear shot. Losses would be catastrophic. Bomb residential neighborhoods, others warned, and Washington will revolt. The American public had been told this was a precision bombing campaign against military targets. Deliberately setting cities on fire would cross a moral and political line that could not be uncrossed. LeMay listened to every objection. He did not interrupt. He did not raise his voice. He did not argue emotionally. Then he answered them with data. He showed that Japanese night fighters were few and poorly coordinated. He demonstrated that heavy flak was ineffective at low altitude. He explained that removing defensive guns reduced aircraft weight by more than 6,000 pounds. Weight that could be replaced with incendiary bombs? 1B-29, stripped and optimized, could carry twice the destructive potential of a fully armed bomber flying high. Multiply that by hundreds of aircraft, and the scale changed entirely. LeMay also addressed the unspoken objection, the one no one wanted to say out loud. Yes, civilians would die. There was no illusion about that. But invasion would kill more. He had read reports from the Pacific. He knew what happened on islands where Japanese forces fought to the last man. He had seen casualty lists from Iwo Jima and Peleliu. He understood that Japan's leadership was preparing its population for a final, suicidal defense of the home islands. This was not a war that would end gently. LeMay framed the choice in terms his staff could not escape. Burn down the neighborhoods, producing the weapons now, or send hundreds of thousands of American soldiers to die, taking those same neighborhoods street by street. This was not about punishment. It was not about revenge. It was about ending the war as quickly as possible. The room fell silent. Every officer present understood the weight of what was being proposed. This was not merely a tactical adjustment. It was a moral crossing point. Once taken, there would be no way to pretend the war was still being fought cleanly. LeMay understood that too. He knew that if the war were lost, he would be judged as a criminal. He accepted that risk the same way he accepted the risk to his bombers and crews. Leadership, in his view, meant owning the consequences of decisions others were unwilling to make. When the objections ended, LeMay made it clear the decision had already been reached. The doctrine would be abandoned. The bombers would be stripped. The attack would go low at night. With fire. History would judge the outcome. For Curtis LeMay, there was only one remaining question worth asking. How many lives could this decision save, and how many would be lost if he refused to make it? With that calculation complete, the plan moved forward. Curtis LeMay did not move forward on instinct alone. Before he ordered a single gun removed from a B-29, he did the math cold, methodical, and unforgiving. Every pound of weight, every gallon of fuel, every bomb carried into Japanese airspace was calculated against one overriding objective: ending the war as quickly as possible. A fully armed B-29 superfortress carried an enormous defensive load. Turrets, ammunition, fire control systems, armor plating, together they weighed more than 6,000 pounds. That weight had always been justified as the price of survival. But LeMay questioned the assumption. Against an enemy whose fighter force was depleted and whose night defenses were weak, that steel was not protection. It was dead weight, remove it. And the equation changed. Each stripped B-29 could carry 6 additional tons of incendiary bombs. Not a marginal increase. A doubling of destructive capacity. Multiply that across hundreds of aircraft, and the scale of the attack transformed completely. What had once been a bombing raid became something else entirely, a sustained, overwhelming application of force designed to collapse an entire system in a single night. LeMay understood something else that doctrine ignored. Tokyo was uniquely vulnerable. The city was not built of stone and concrete. It was built of wood and paper. Entire neighborhoods were packed with tightly spaced homes, connected by narrow streets that trapped heat and funneled wind. Most buildings dated back generations, constructed long before anyone imagined air raids on this scale. Firefighting infrastructure was limited. Water mains were fragile. Fire breaks were inadequate. Tokyo had survived earthquakes and storms. It was not built to survive fire from the sky. The choice of weapon reflected that reality. High explosive bombs shattered buildings, but they did not guarantee destruction. Incendiaries were different. Once they ignited, they spread, feeding on everything around them. Fires merged. Heat generated wind. Wind fed fire. Given the right conditions, flames became self-sustaining, unstoppable. The goal was not destruction by explosion. It was destruction by flame. LeMay planners selected incendiary clusters specifically designed for urban environments. Small bomblets that scattered over wide areas, igniting dozens of fires at once. Individually, they were limited. Together, they were catastrophic. One bomber could start hundreds of fires. Hundreds of bombers could ignite an entire district. Critically, this approach did not rely on pinpoint accuracy. It did not require clear skies or perfect visibility. It turned Japan's own industrial dispersion into a weakness. The same neighborhoods that housed workshops and home factories would now serve as fuel. LeMay did not delude himself. About the human cost, civilians would die. There was no language sterile enough to hide that fact. Fire did not distinguish between a machine shop and a bedroom, between a worker and a child asleep on a floor mat. The men planning the raid understood that once the first bombs fell, events would move beyond control, but LeMay also knew what the alternative looked like. He had read intelligence projections for Operation Downfall. He knew how Japan had fought on Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. He knew that surrender was not part of the enemy's strategic culture. Japanese forces had demonstrated again and again that they would fight until annihilated, and that civilians would be pulled into that struggle, whether they wanted to be or not. An invasion of the home islands would not be a battle. It would be a massacre. American soldiers would die by the hundreds of thousands. Japanese civilians would die by the millions. Cities would be destroyed anyway, only this time, building by building, street by street, with bayonets and grenades instead of bombs. This was not a choice between good and evil. It was a choice between terrible and worse. LeMay framed the decision in terms he believed were honest. Firebombing Tokyo was not about punishment or revenge. It was about shock-breaking Japan's capacity to wage war in a way that invasion could not do quickly enough. If Japan's industrial system collapsed, its military would collapse with it. If the war ended sooner, lives American and Japanese would be spared in the long run. He knew that history would not be kind. He knew that images of burned cities would haunt the war's memory. He also knew that no one would remember the soldiers who never had to land on those beaches. The casualties that existed only on paper because the invasion never came, leadership, in LeMay's view, meant accepting responsibility for outcomes that others would prefer to avoid. It meant choosing the option that ended the war fastest, even if that option would forever stain one's reputation. The plan broke every rule because the rules no longer applied, precision bombing assumed, factories separated from civilians. High-altitude doctrine assumed predictable targets and weather. Defensive formations assumed enemy fighters capable of coordinated interception. None of those assumptions were true in Japan in 1945. So LeMay discarded them. The bombers would fly light. They would fly low. They would fly at night. And they would bring fire in quantities never seen before. Once the decision was made, there was no turning back. Crews would be briefed. Guns would be stripped. Bomb bays would be filled to their limits. The machinery of war would move forward, driven by a single, ruthless logic. If the war was going to end, it would end in flames rather than on invasion beaches. Whether history would forgive that choice was a question for another generation. Just after midnight on March 10, 1945, the first B-29 superfortresses crossed the Japanese coastline. They came in low, far lower than anyone on the ground expected, only 5,000 feet above the city. From that altitude, Tokyo was no abstract target on a map. It was visible, immediate, terrifyingly close. Crews could see rooftops, streets, and the faint glow of lights breaking through blackout curtains. They could see the city breathing beneath them. The lead aircraft were the pathfinders. Their job was not destruction, but preparation. As they approached eastern Tokyo, bomb bay doors opened and the first incendiaries fell. They struck the ground in carefully planned patterns, igniting fires that formed a massive cross across the Shitamachi district. These flames were not random. They were markers, guides for the waves that followed, a signal that the trap had been set. Moments later, the main force arrived, one after another. B-29s streamed into the target area, their engines forming a continuous roar that rolled across the city. Thousands of incendiary clusters dropped from the bomb bays, breaking open in midair and scattering dozens of smaller bomblets. Each one struck the ground and ignited instantly, bursting into white-hot flame. Jellied gasoline clung to wood, paper, and fabric. Burning at temperatures few materials could withstand. At first, the fires were separate individual blazes scattered across neighborhoods. Then they began to merge. Wind rushed in to feed the flames. Heat rose violently, pulling more oxygen from the surrounding streets. The fires grew faster, hotter, stronger. What had started as a bombing raid was transforming into something far more dangerous. A firestorm was born. The temperature climbed beyond anything the city had ever experienced. Asphalt softened. Steel warped. Concrete cracked and spalled. Streets became furnaces, radiating heat so intense that people collapsed before they could escape. Air raid shelters, designed to protect against explosions, became death traps as oxygen was sucked away, and temperatures soared. The firestorm created its own weather. Hurricane-force winds tore through the city, flattening structures that had not yet burned and feeding the inferno with fresh fuel. Flames leapt from building to building, block to block, faster than any fire brigade could respond. Water mains shattered under the heat and pressure, leaving firefighters helpless as hoses ran dry. Equipment melted. Engines stalled. Men fled. Above it all, the bombers continued to arrive. Pilots reported violent updrafts that lifted their aircraft hundreds of feet without warning. Some struggled to maintain control as superheated air slammed into their wings. From miles away, crews could see the glow of the fire reflecting off clouds, turning the night sky red. Smoke rose to bomber altitude, filling cockpits with the acrid stench of burning wood, oil, and flesh. Below, escape became nearly impossible, streets clogged with panicked civilians. Families fled carrying what little they could, only to find themselves trapped by walls of flame. Canals and rivers filled with people seeking refuge, many of whom were overcome by heat or smoke before they reached safety. Entire neighborhoods vanished in hours, reduced to ash and twisted metal. The the bombing continued for hours. Wave after wave, each aircraft adding fuel to a disaster already beyond control. By the time the last B-29s approached Tokyo, the target area was no longer a city, it was a burning wasteland visible from 100 miles away. Some crews dropped their bombs through smoke so thick they could not see the ground, aiming only by reference to the massive ring of fire below. Anti-aircraft fire was sporadic and largely ineffective. Japanese defenses, designed to fight high-altitude formations, fired blindly into empty sky. Fighters were few, disorganized, and unable to coordinate in the chaos. The night belonged to the bombers and to the fire. By dawn, the firestorm began to burn itself out, having consumed nearly everything it could reach. 15 square miles of Tokyo were gone. Entire districts that had existed for centuries had been erased in a single night. Where homes, workshops, and markets once stood, there was nothing but smoking ruins. The human toll was staggering. Approximately 100,000 people were dead men. Women, children, entire families lost together. Tens of thousands more were injured, burned, or suffocated. More than 1 million survivors were suddenly homeless. Wandering through the ruins of a city that no longer existed, the cost in the air was far smaller. But not insignificant. 14 American bombers failed to return. Crews were lost to accidents, mechanical failures, and scattered defenses. For the men who flew the mission, the silence on the long flight home was heavy. They had done what they were ordered to do. They had survived. And they knew they had witnessed something no one could ever truly explain. When the sun rose over Tokyo on March 10th, it revealed a city fundamentally changed. Not damaged. Not wounded. Broken. The night of fire had achieved exactly what it was designed to do. Japan's largest industrial district lay in ruins. War production embedded in those neighborhoods had ceased to exist. The psychological shock was immense, both to those who endured it and to those who ordered it. The most destructive air raid in history was over. Its consequences were only beginning.
When the first after-action reports reached Washington, the reaction was not celebration. It was silent. Senior commanders and civilian officials read through the figures again and again, searching for errors. Damage assessments from Tokyo showed destruction on a scale no one had predicted so quickly. In a single night, more urban areas had been eliminated than in months of high-altitude precision bombing. Entire industrial districts had ceased to exist. Production lines were gone. Not damaged, not disrupted, but erased. The contrast was impossible to ignore. For 3 months, B-29s flying by the book had struggled to make measurable progress. One night of low-altitude incendiary bombing had accomplished more than the entire previous campaign combined. The numbers spoke with brutal clarity. This was not a marginal improvement. It was a transformation in effectiveness. There was debate, of course. Some officials questioned whether the civilian casualties could ever be justified. Others worried about political fallout if the scale of destruction became widely known. But the war was not being fought in abstract moral arguments. It was being fought against casualty projections that continued to climb as invasion planning moved forward. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, understood the implications immediately. He had staked his reputation and billions of dollars on the B-29 program. If strategic bombing was going to work, it had to work decisively. The Tokyo raid proved that it could. Within days, authorization was granted. LeMay was ordered to continue. The campaign expanded rapidly. Over the following weeks, B-29s struck Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and dozens of other cities using the same tactics. Each raid compounded the damage of the last. Fires swept through urban centers. Power grids collapsed. Transportation networks disintegrated. Japanese industrial output fell sharply as workshops and home factories vanished. By summer 1945, Japan's war economy was in free fall. Aircraft production plummeted. Ammunition shortages became critical. Fuel reserves evaporated. The ability to sustain large-scale military operations eroded month by month. At the same time, invasion plans were quietly reassessed. Okinawa had already revealed the cost of fighting on Japanese soil. Casualty reports from that battle confirmed the worst fears of planners. If one island could exact such a toll, the home islands would be exponentially worse. As the bombing campaign intensified and Japan's capacity to resist weakened, the urgency of invasion diminished. First, the invasion was postponed. Then, it was effectively abandoned. When atomic bombs were dropped in August, they were delivered by the same aircraft LeMay had shaped and deployed. Within days, Japan announced its surrender. The war ended without Allied troops storming beaches on Kyushu or Honshu. Operation Downfall remained a plan on paper, a grim calculation that never became reality. No American soldier had to fight through Japan's cities street by street. The war had ended in the air. The cost was immense and undeniable. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians were dead. 67 cities lay in ruins. The moral weight of those decisions would be debated for generations. But in August 1945, the fighting stopped. For the men who had flown the bombers, for the soldiers who never received invasion orders, and for families waiting at home, the meaning was painfully clear. The war was over, and it had ended not with an invasion but with fire, steel, and decisions that changed the course of history. History doesn't offer clean choices. Curtis LeMay never denied what he had done. He understood that victory came at a terrible cost. History still debates whether the firebombing of Japan was justified. But one fact remains: the invasion never happened, and millions went home who might not have. If you want more stories that explore the hard choices, the brutal realities, and the turning points of World War II, subscribe to WW2 Rewind. Because history isn't just about what happened, it's about why it happened.